I'm Lauren Golembiewski. I'm a conversation designer and CEO and co-founder of Voxable, which is the design platform for teams that want to build better voice and chat apps.
And I'm Matt Buck, the CTO of Voxable. And we're here today to talk about designer and developer collaboration when building conversational apps.
Yeah.
So Lauren and I are actually partners in business and life. We've been conversational AI consultants for the past 6 years and spent most of that time helping clients like South by Southwest, AT&T, GoDaddy, Keller Williams design and develop their conversational apps.
And the focus on our consulting work has always been about fostering great designer and developer collaboration, because we know that's what ultimately leads to great user experiences. But throughout that time, working with those clients, we realized there are a lot of barriers that exist between designers and developers. And so that's what actually led us to build Voxable, the Voxable design platform that streamlines that process. But back to our consulting work, before we built Voxable, we actually have been doing a ton of research in how conversation design and development teams work together at various organizations. So today, we're going to discuss some insights from that research, as well as a framework that we've developed for building better level 3 conversational AI assistants that anyone can use no matter what channels or technologies they're building for. Okay, so let's start by diving into some of our research. First of all, this research was gathered through interviews with conversation design professionals about their current processes and pain points for designing and developing intuitive conversational interfaces. We interviewed over 30 individuals and included a wide range of roles, from researchers, UX designers, conversation designers, developers, solutions architects, just to name a few of the titles. And we also spoke to small companies and freelance designers, all the way to large teams and business leaders at enterprise organizations. So one of our insights is there are a lot of different roles across conversational app teams. And for the rest of the talk, we're going to refer broadly to design as the process of defining and documenting a conversational interaction or experience before it's implemented. And then we're going to talk about conversational development as the process of implementing those designs into a piece of software. So when we say designer and developer, we're using those terms pretty broadly. They can actually cover a wide range of roles. Okay, so let's get back to our research. We learned a lot about how companies think about conversation design and development, and what type of support they need, and where their largest pain points are. And we saw some trends emerge from this research. One of the biggest trends is that companies are realizing they need to invest more intentionally in that definition process. And they're actually waking up to the power of conversation design. A lot of the companies that we spoke to started out by struggling to figure out the right process and people to put in place. Some of those companies start with absolutely no process and jump right into the technology, into writing code. Some companies do work on that specification and documentation process, but they sometimes don't include the right roles. They don't have any UX researchers or designers or copywriters that are included in that definition process. So that's kind of one large problem we saw. The second problem for the companies that are investing in some of that design and UX research, there are a ton of ways for them to do their jobs, to specify those conversational apps before it gets to development. There's a lot of tools that teams end up using that aren't actually built for the purpose that they're using them for, which means they're often hacking together multiple tools, word processors, and spreadsheets, and they're hacking together all these tools just to design one application and specify, one app. And then another thing we learned was that the assets and artifacts that were produced in this documentation process tended to be really brittle, and they didn't really support the designers and developers collaborating beyond the launch of their app when they were focused on growing it. And this often left teams and organizations really out of sync. The teams would be out of sync due to that misalignment of process and tools. And the assets are out of sync with the actual product. So this leaves nobody really knowing how the current system that's deployed should actually behave or what was intended for it to behave.
So throughout all of this research, Lauren and I started to envision a system by which teams and organizations can think about managing the design, development, and maintenance of their conversational applications and experiences. We've been iterating on this system for the past 6 years, applying it in our consulting business, and this is also what ultimately informed the Voxable design platform. But in its essence, any team and organization can adopt the principles behind this system regardless of the tools that they're using. The goal is ultimately for the designers defining and documenting the experience and the developers implementing those experiences to work within a system that allows them to effectively collaborate so that the end users are happy and the business is more successful. So we've been calling this a conversation management system, or COMS. It's a framework for how companies should be thinking broadly about the conversational apps and systems that they use and develop, and how they should all be linked together by processes and tooling. Like any software design and development process, it will be comprised of many different tools working in conjunction with one another. So COMS is a system for providing a shared source of truth for the behavior of a conversational experience. So first, let's talk about what designers and developers need out of this type of system.
All right, designers, that is my role. Designers need flexible, unencumbered ways to explore a conversational app. This is so that they can document all the different and unexpected inputs from users. They need a blank canvas that's not really tied to implementation, which will actually allow them to explore solutions outside of already established channels and technologies. So for example, say I'm interacting with Google Assistant, but that application would actually best serve the user by sending an email or a text message. How do I, as a designer, account for something like that? And then also account for all of the different UI elements and responses that can be contained in any of those individual channels that my application is using. Throughout that definition of content, I also need to feedback from the system and the users, the end users. Designers need a feedback in conversational experiences because they need to actually hear or see how the interaction will play out. And this really proves out whether or not their system is a natural interaction or will fall flat with the user. And finally, they need a way to manage collaboration so that they can better communicate all the different moving pieces of the system, the project requirements, the business needs across all of the different team members and stakeholders, because there's a lot of people who ultimately will need to influence one of these conversational apps at scale.
Now, this probably doesn't come as news to many of you watching this talk, but designers and developers are different. They're different groups of folks, and they have different needs when it comes to tooling. So while designers are often visual thinkers and prefer to work within a visual user interface, engineers sometimes prefer to work with raw, unstructured data. And we actually like CLIs, or command line interfaces. So rather than a visual UI, engineers prefer to access data via an API and a CLI, something that actually allows us to get at this data in a structured way. And so in this case, that structure should actually encode the structure of the conversation, all of the messages that are being sent, in what order they're being sent, which actors are sending those messages, and the context at each point in the conversation. And we, as developers, we need to be allowed to have access to that content that has been approved by the team, and to do so in an automated fashion. So I want only the content that's been through legal and brand and marketing, and I'd like access to it via an API so that I, as an engineer, can script this process, so that I can automate it and include it either in my CI/CD process or any kind of build tooling that we have for our team. And this means that my conversational designs can actually serve as the basis for my NLU model or for my automated tests. The other thing that's very, very important to engineers is version control. Too often, we've seen teams get locked into these systems that promise some kind of world-class NLU, but offer no form of version control. And I'd like to compliment Alan Nickel, the CTO of our gracious host Raza, for being very clear with people that while conversational software is different in some ways, version control is still very, very important. It's still just software, so we need to follow these same best practices. So if my NLU model, for instance, determines how our software behaves, and then anything, like anything that determines how our software behaves, it needs to be under version control. Every engineer needs to know who made a change, why that change was made, and when it was made. That's the only way to reliably reproduce errors when I'm trying to hunt down a bug, as well as just a host of other reasons that version control is very important. And so none of this actually means that developers don't need visual assets, of course. Personally, I still, as a conversational engineer, prefer to work with flowcharts. These visualize all the potential paths that I know I'm going to need to support in this conversational experience. I also prefer these flowcharts to actually map the way that context is changing throughout that conversation. And ideally, I want to be able to give feedback directly on that asset so that I can point out specifically where things might not be possible due to technical constraints. Folks who work on the various smart speaker platforms are probably very familiar having those conversations between designers and developers. Hey, that's a really cool idea, but it's not going to work. And I'm going to show you exactly in this flowchart where we're having that problem. And they also just allow me to ask for clarification on any of the designs.
Finally, we need to think about what businesses and teams need as a whole. One big downfall that we see is, to Matt's point about being locked into a particular platform or team, that often means that companies and enterprises are losing control over their data and the underlying business intelligence that powers all of their application within the organization. So it's important to ensure that all of these tools and processes you're choosing give you ultimate data management and control. Also, these businesses are looking to operationalize. They know that they need to gain some maturity in systematizing these processes across their organization, whether it's data management and science, content management systems and marketing, conversation design systems and design operations, DevOps, as well as research operations. All of these layer into a system that can span the organization and help conversational applications no matter what business unit is creating them. And also, a shared source of truth is really the pillar for a business looking to operationalize their conversational apps or conversational design and development processes, because that actually is a place where they can know that their business is communicating and is saying what the brand wants it to say. And the entire organization can feed off of this single source of truth and use it on conversational apps as well as in many other places.
Okay, so now that we've laid out some of the principles behind comms, let's dive into the mental model that underlies it. So mental models help us develop a shared understanding across an organization regarding how to approach a certain class of problem. So developing a shared mental model for conversation management simplifies communication and collaboration in conversational AI. So you may have different terms on each individual team. The engineers may have terms that are specific to the various platforms that they're using, but aligning on a single mental model gives the entire company a common vernacular to discuss conversational AI. So it breaks down conversational interaction into these pieces. So in the conversation management system, we say that conversations are composed of actors who send messages, and everything is annotated with context. And context is, of course, any piece of information relevant to the task at hand. That context is going to drive the course of the conversation, which is why level 3 assistants are contextual, because context is hugely important to having useful conversations. So let's briefly dive into each of these topics.
All right, actors are the participants in any given conversation. We know they can be human, they can be bot. Sometimes we have multiple humans in a conversation, sometimes multiple bots. And maybe as we advance to level 4 and 5 assistants, we'll actually have teams of autonomous bots interacting independently. But for our focus on actors, we need to think about what that deliverable or handoff asset is between the designer and developer when focused on actors. And this really comes down to personas. We're talking about user personas as well as bot personas. User personas are what the makeup of your users are. And there's lots of controversy about how user personas are used in user experience research. Liz Stocko, who's a conversation analyst many of you may be familiar with, has been pointing out that there can be many issues with user personas. But really, it's about having a core understanding of who your users are so that you can speak to them with a bot persona, so that the language your bot uses can resonate with who those users are and aspects about them. I would encourage you to do real research to develop those personas and truly know who your users are, who the actors are in the conversation.
Great. And so next up, we'll tackle messages. So a message is sent by an actor to the other actors in a conversation. So messages can either be textual, if we're talking about a chatbot or an SMS interaction, audio in the case of a voice system, or multimodal, where we're dealing with potentially visual and maybe gestural UI as well. And conversations can either be one-to-one between a single user and a single bot, or multi-party. So we may have one-to-many users interacting with one-to-many bots. And so the handoff asset, when we're talking about messages, needs to actually be the text or visual UI of the bot responses, as well as the user messages themselves. So we may need to gather feedback and approval, like we've talked about, from various stakeholders. Because this is a customer touch point, you'll have legal, brand and marketing team. They're going to want to have some say over what the bot is actually saying. And developers actually want to be able to reference that content that they should be using and not be in charge of maintaining it, making sure that the folks who want to have that level of access are able to manage it themselves. And this is where you want to focus on having a system that enables really easy feedback, but also structured access to the content. So user messages can form the basis of our NLU model, and the bot messages are the content of the system that we're building. So context is the next subject. Context is the information relevant to the task at hand, right? What's relevant to this conversation and what this user is attempting to do. It's shared between actors. So we have the context that we know about, the context that the user tells us about, and the context that we know we're missing in order to perform a task. It forms the basis of the shared understanding between a user and a bot. And that shared understanding is how we negotiate all conversations, even those between humans. And context changes over the course of a conversation. So what is the user's current situation? Are they driving a car? Are they in the kitchen? Are their hands free currently? What's the time of day? What has been said previously in this conversation? What do we know about the user perhaps from prior conversations that we've had with them? What do we know about this user that resides in other systems? All of this information is crucial for understanding how to design and implement conversational AI. So understanding the state of this shared context at any point in the conversation is actually what's going to guide the next step in that conversation. Maybe I need to gather another piece of information from the user. Perhaps I need to clarify something. As an engineer, questions of how to store and manage context are key to the architecture of the system itself. Since context applies to every aspect of the system, we don't really have a handoff goal, or we don't have a handoff asset rather, but a goal. And that is to track context within our designs. So anytime we're handing off a design, we should be indicating what the context is and how it's changing throughout that interaction. And we want to make sure that that prior context is accounted for in the designs and made clear to the engineers, whether the user is logged in or logged out, the time of day, etc.
Yeah. So finally, how do all those things come together? How does the designer actually compose all these different pieces? Those come together in scripts, often called sample scripts or sample dialogues, and they represent a sample conversation between the actors. It connects the actors to the messages that they're sending, annotated with that rich context. It can also include other things like notes and other metadata like stage directions. And the handoff goal for scripts is just to create as many scripts as is relevant to your app. And then you actually have to practice those scripts to hear that interaction, getting that feedback about how the interaction sounds to your user. And that's, again, the crucial step for ensuring it sounds natural and flows smoothly. Speaking of flow, we have to think about how all of these scripts are connected together into a structure. Flowcharts display the many potential paths that a conversation can take. Opinions actually vary pretty widely on whether a flowchart is the right asset, but in our opinion, there's still a great way to align on a conversational system or behavior. Some think that they are a little bit too rigid, but we view it as a useful model, not necessarily a complete representation of the entire system. So flowcharts should also represent as much of the entire system as you possibly can anticipate, and annotated with notes that explain that system, as well as context and maybe even UI elements, visual UI, so developers can understand really the entire complexity. All right, so that is the conversation management system. I know that we just scratched the surface with all that is contained within it. We hope that this was insightful for y'all. And if you want to learn more, there are lots of opportunities to do so. First, get your designers and developers talking, or if you are one of those two, go find your partner and collaborate, talk with them. A lot of these principles come from design and development software processes that are tried and true. You can also attend conferences like this. We also host an organization called Convo Collective, which is a community, an open and inclusive community for anyone who wants to talk about design and development of conversational AI. And Voxable is continually writing and thinking about these things. So be sure to follow us and sign up for our beta if you're interested in streamlining your conversation management system. Thanks so much.